I wasn't here. Tonight's program is sponsored by John and Susie Littlefield, who I believe are at the Sturgis Library meeting, so are not here tonight. Or am I lying? Oh, Susie, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So tonight's speaker, Joe Yukna, is the co-founder of the Cape Cod Military Museum. His fellow founder is Jerry Ellis, a Korean War veteran. Mr. Yukna is a civilian, but worked as a Department of Defense police officer on Camp Edwards. Curiosity about the vintage World War II building still standing, barely, on the barracks, on the campgrounds, led Mr. Yukna to do some research. The information, artifacts, and knowledge he gathered led to the founding of the Cape Cod Military Museum. Originally, he was to be given 2 barracks and 6 acres on Camp Edwards, which was then opened to the public. Then 9/11 occurred, and the camp was shut down. So, are you still homeless?
We're still homeless. Yeah.
Still homeless, wandering in the dark. But tonight, Mr. Yukna is here with Sergeant Stubby, who you might have met outside, to talk about the uses of animals in World War I. Mr. Yukna.
Thank you. All right. The first animals we're going to talk about is actually why this lecture got started. I was doing research on the Yankee Division and Sergeant Stubby when I came across this factoid. In desperation to fight the U-boat menace, the British Army tried to train seagulls to defecate on periscopes. Well, remember, there was no sonar, there was no radar. The first indication you had that a U-boat was around was a torpedo coming at you. And they also hoped that the seagulls circling around the periscope would make it easy for them to spot. It didn't work, but that factoid, I said, wow, what were they trying to do with animals back then? So war is for the birds. There were, especially in World War I, communications were a crucial component of warfare. Radios were new and unreliable. The massive amount of artillery used, 1.5 billion, not million, billion shells were fired. That meant any telephone lines would be ripped up. This left messengers, runners, human and animal. Homing pigeons were an essential part of the World War I military communications system. 100,000 pigeons were deployed in the Great War by the Allies and 1 million by Germany and the Central Powers. The birds had an astonishing 95% success rate. I am not going forward. Oh, there, okay. It took a while. This is a portable coop. The use of pigeons is not new. They were used by the ancient Egyptians to report flooding on the Nile. That's how long pigeons have been used. Why do pigeons return to the coop? Does anybody know? Love. They bond with a mate, and what they'll do is they'll take the male away from the female, so he flies back to get back to his honey. And to speed this up, they'll often put a strange male in the cage, in the coop with his wife, before they take him away. Okay? So it's love, the lovebirds. That's why they fly like a bolt to get home. They were deployed from warships, submarines, And that's a land ship. See, tanks was a code word. It didn't mean anything. They used the code word tanks to cover up the metal they were getting in to build the armored land ships. Tanks really should be called land ships. And they were originally designed by the Navy. Winston Churchill was very involved in the first tanks. This is an interesting picture because it shows the juxtaposition. You have a man on a motorcycle with pigeons on his back. That's the weird juxtaposition in history that World War I really was, because it was the real first real modern warfare. There were gas attacks, so they had to have gas-proof coops for the pigeons. They even did aerial photography using pigeons. That's a camera on that pigeon's neck. They had special sharpshooters to take pigeons out at the front. They had trained hawks and falcons to kill the pigeons in flight. Military homing pigeons, these birds that work to save the lives of our boys in France. That's not an idle boast. In October 4th, 1918, a battalion of the 77th Infantry advanced into German lines. They were soon cut off and surrounded by German troops. Commanders had no way of knowing that the Americans held their ground. American heavy artillery started to bombard the lost battalion's position on accident, killing 30 men as they held their position. Major Whitley's tried to send messages back via homing pigeon. He and his men watched helplessly as bird after bird was shot out of the sky by German fire. With supplies running out and casualties rapidly mounting, Major Whitley desperately sent out his last pigeon, Cher Ami, to the American lines with a note that simply read, "We are along the road parallel to 27.64. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly upon us. For heaven's sake, stop it." With the fire raining down on all sides of them, Cher Ami was now the last chance the lost battalion had to walk off that hill alive. The brave bird flew straight into the German fire, dodging bullets as he went. However, his luck did not last for long. Cher Ami was hit in the chest soon after takeoff, as the American soldiers watched in horror as the last hope hit the ground. Against all odds, Cher Ami got up again. Wounded but still alive, the little bird took flight again, charging head-on to wave after wave of gunfire. By the end of the trip, he covered 25 miles in roughly half an hour. He arrived safely at base, heavily wounded but alive. Army medics were able to save Cher Ami's life, but his right leg was barely attached to his body and he was blind in one eye. However, because Cher Ami's delivery of the note, the artillery stopped and took up new firing coordinates away from the American lines. The next day, shells started to fall on German positions, relieving the pressure on the bloodied 77th, and the battles soon turned in the Americans' favor. On October 8th, 194 men made it back to the American lines thanks to Cher Ami's sacrifice. The Croix de Guerre from France was awarded to Cher Ami. Cher Ami survived his wounds, but not the march of time. He passed and is now stuffed in the Smithsonian Institute. Many birds served as pets and mascots, from the common crow to the barnyard rooster. This rooster was named Jack, and he was excellent sentry as he would attack anything that he did not recognize approaching his position. There were exotic birds, a kookaburra from Australia, golden eagle in India. The most used and abused animal in World War I, however, was the war horse. At the start of the war, all nations had mounted units. It took quite a while before the older generals figured out the age of the horse was over. Cavalry charges were totally ineffective against mass modern artillery, machine guns, and barbed wire. In the first day of the war on the Eastern Front, the Russians had 50,000 Cossacks and their mounts killed in one day. That's almost what we lost in Vietnam in 10 years. one day. By the end of the war, an estimated 8 million horses would be killed. The automobile was a fairly new invention, and horses could handle mud much better than trucks. So they were used throughout the war as draft animals. The mud in World War I was different from the mud we're used to. The unimaginable amount of shells that pummeled the earth and sent vibrations through the wet soil churned it up until basically it was a virtual quicksand. When conditions would not allow them to pull a wagon, a horse could still carry shells on its back through the mud. The demands of war created very inhumane conditions for the horse. Of course, I showed Germans whipping the horses. In fact, the blockade by England of Germany caused most of the German horses to die of starvation. German U-boats sent thousands of horses and mules to the bottom of the sea. The greatest amount of cargo and most expensive items shipped from England to France was fodder for horses, not bullets, not artillery. The grass and grain they had to feed the horses. That was the number one thing. Because the horses were taken off of the farms, they were conscripted by both the Allied Central Powers, this left them to use one of the strangest draft animals in the war. This is a British elephant, that's a German elephant, were used as draft animals because they didn't have enough horses, because the military had used them up. There were not enough horses in England and France, so America and Canada shipped over 650,000 horses. Shipping horses in tight quarters led to disease and parasites taking a toll. The horse took a month of rehabilitation after an ocean crossing before they were ready to use. That's why the Ford trucks were much more popular, because they'd come over in the crate. You take open the crate and use the crate to build the body of the truck, and it was ready to roll in a couple hours. So the difference between mechanized and horse was immense. Believe it or not, most of the men who fought in World War I were from the city and had very little experience with horses. More than a few were kicked and killed before they learned the do's and don'ts of horse management. Once they learned to care for their horses, the men soon fell in love with them and their horses. They would mourn their loss just like any other soldier. One of the things that's missing today for people, I think, is the bond that man and beast had back then. Mules shared the same fate as equine cousins. If an animal went down from its wounds, disease, or injury, it was cut out of its harness and the mission continued. The mule's sire, the donkey, was used, especially in mountainous terrain. Because of man's love for horses, or for the fact that it was harder to replace a horse than a soldier, veterinary care was very extensive. They had horse ambulances. And you can't read that, but that's the American Red Star, which was the animal version of the Red Cross. Before, 'cause we didn't enter the war till late, till 1917, had been going on since 1914. And the Massachusetts MSPCA was huge in helping out the animals in war. Okay. My great-granduncle was in World War I. One of the few conversations I can remember having with him was that when he was in America, they did everything by horse. When he got to France, everything was done by truck. And the other thing he told me to do was to put used motor oil on all your wooden tools, and they won't rot. So, from Uncle Frank to you. Of course, protecting horses meant they had to have gas masks as well. Cavalry was used extensively in other areas of this global conflict, especially in Palestine. The ship of the desert, the camel, was also used. This image of the Australian Camel Corps attacking at the Battle of Sharia Beersheba, almost every man and camel in this photograph would perish in the attack. Here's a Red Crescent camel. Does anybody know what these camels are carrying? Wounded soldiers. The tent is to keep the sun off their faces because you'd be laying face up on your stretcher. But they can carry two people. They're a very strong animal. That would take 4 guys and you couldn't go more than 100 yards, So they were very useful. This picture sort of sums up the cavalry now as a tank or a land ship. It just shows the difference. The deprivation of the horse did not end with the war. It would cost so much money to rehab and ship the horses back to America or England. A lot of them, almost all of them, was slaughtered for food because the Germans actually had starved the people of Belgium by stealing all their crops to feed their troops. The American Veterinary Corps took this photograph at the end of the war to honor the horse and the sacrifices it made. The deprivation of the horse didn't even end with the horse's death. They had to bury them very deep because of wolves. The wolves had proliferated so much that on the Eastern Front, the Austrian army and the Russian army called for a truce to fight off wolf attacks. There'd be 5,000 wolves attacking a position at one time. What happened, what made them totally unafraid of men, and of course, with all the food that was around dead horses, dead men, they just could breed all as much as they wanted to, was the Russian habit of dropping severely wounded guys who looked they weren't going to make it off their ambulances as they were heading back to the hospital. So the wolves learned to eat half-alive Russian soldiers. But can you imagine having to call a truce so you could fight wolves? The next most common used animal was the wolf's cousin, the dog. 1 million dogs would perish in the conflict. They were used to carry messengers. They were trained to run as fast as they could. You can see the little blur in the right corner. That's the dog running away as fast as they can so it wouldn't get shot, so they trained to sprint when they got their message. They were used as draft animals. Okay. Dogs weren't just pets back in the day. Your Rottweiler would pull your milk cart out to your herd because you didn't bring the cows in to milk them. You went out to milk them. Herd the cattle up, then pull the full milk cart back. This wasn't just the army. The civilians used dogs as draft animals as well. They were used as ratters. The terrier in this picture is showing the amount of rats he killed in 15 minutes in a trench. They were used to pull communication cable. They were used as sentry dogs and scout dogs. The scout dog would alert but wouldn't bark to let you know the enemy was out there because they can hear better than we can, and obviously they can smell better than we can. They were mercy dogs that would travel no man's land with medical supplies on them, looking for wounded soldiers. The soldier could then take the medical supplies out and treat his wounds. They're also called mercy dogs because if a soldier was too badly wounded to take out the supplies, the dog would lay with him until he passed. We don't deserve dogs. Okay, this is a guard dog in a trench. Again, alerting them to the enemy's presence. I believe that the thing is now on. Yeah, it's doing it on its own. So I'm going to try to talk as fast as it goes. The best job you could have would be a mascot. Here's a Newfie mascot, probably with a Canadian unit. Yeah, there's some German mascots. Rags was an American mascot dog that became very useful. He was stepped on by some soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division. He looked like a pile of rags in Paris, and they apologized, and he followed them back to their base because if they apologized, they're nicer than what he was getting. He became the dog of a Jimmy Donovan, and he was a lineman, and he would go out looking for breaks in the wire. And Rags became good at determining where the break in the wire was, better than he was. He would find breaks that he didn't even know existed. Probably it was humming or something like that, who knows. I think it stopped, that's good. All right. Rags would also hear better than the soldiers did, so he'd drop to the ground at the first sound of mortars being fired, artillery being fired, before it landed. And soldiers soon learned, if Rags laid down, you laid down. But him and Jimmy were wounded in a mustard gas, heavy explosive attack, and they smuggled Rags back onto the ship when he was heading home. Jimmy died, but Rags wormed his way into the commander's family on the base that he died at and was cared for by the commander's 2 young daughters. And he lost an eye in the attack, but he lived a long, happy life. But we're going to talk about Stubby, the Yankee divisions. He wandered onto the Yale campus and started following the soldiers around, performing close order drill with them. He was adopted by Corporal Robert Conroy. He soon became the boys' mascot. He drilled with the troops, even learned how to salute. There's Conroy and Stubby. You can see the real Stubby's a little smaller than my Stubby, but looks similar. I haven't quite taught Stubby how to salute, but he will be doing some tricks for us in the reception room after the lecture. He outragged his owner. His owner was only a corporal. He was a sergeant. He was the only dog to get rank in the Army. He could hear better than humans and was capable of warning them of incoming shells. He was excellent locating wounded soldiers in no man's land. He wouldn't, however, go to the aid of wounded Germans. He could tell who was a German, who was an American. He wouldn't help wounded Germans. He was in the retaking of Chateau Thierry, the grateful woman of the town made Stubby a jacket to wear all his medals on. He was wounded by a stormtrooper throwing a grenade at him. He was wounded by poison gas and was very good at picking up the smell of gas before the humans did. In fact, by the time you smelled mustard gas, you already were damaged. And he'd go crazy and attack, and then they'd put his mask on, they'd put their mask on. So he was wounded that way. When he was taken back to the, there he is saluting. When he went to get wounded, we didn't have veterinary care, so he went to the regular hospital to be taken care of. And he was so good for the boys' morale when he was in the hospital, he was made a lifelong member of the American Red Cross. His most famous stunt was he captured a German spy. He heard a German who had crept forward to draw out the American lines for an artillery barrage and attacked him on his own and knocked him down and held him by the seat of his pants till other doughboys came and brought him in. At that point, the commander of the 102nd Infantry Regiment made him a sergeant, and that's when he got rank on his owner. There's his vest with all his medals on it. While on leave after the war, he saved a little girl from getting hit by a car in Paris. He came home a hero. And there he is walking the Victory Parade in Hartford, because he was at the 102nd for Connecticut, was in Connecticut, based in Connecticut, but part of the Yankee Division, which covered all of New England. They made a movie, animated movie. It's a really good movie. Gérard Depardieu plays the Pouly, the French guy in it. Helena Bonham Carter is Conway's sister. It didn't really do well because it was hard to market, because it's not a Disney happy, there are people die in it, movie, but it's also not really just a kid's movie. So if you have kids, I'd recommend it. It's a really good piece. And I got stubby because he looked like the animated character in the movie. That's him a little younger. And there he is now. Neither Rags nor Stubby were the most famous dog of World War I. Rin Tin Tin was. In fact, he became the most famous dog of all time. Rin Tin Tin got his name because Nanette and Rin Tin Tin were part of a French legend that grew up around a real event. A French couple were on a railway platform when it came under German bombardment. The couple clung to each other. When the bombardment ceased, the train station was in ruins and many people were killed and injured. Nanette and Rin Tin Tin, holding each other, were miraculously uninjured. French women fashioned little dolls of the couple to give to American soldiers as good luck charms. That's Nanette and Rin Tin Tin. So in 1918, when a soldier, Leland Duncan, found a bombed-out German war dog kennel with only 2 puppies left alive, a boy and a girl, he named them after the good luck dolls, Nanette and Rin Tin Tin. What he didn't realize was Nanette was the boy in the story. Rin Tin Tin was the girl. They're French, you know. He became a film star. In fact, he was supposed to win. He got the most votes for the first Oscar. He was a top grossing actor of that year. But the Academy decided they couldn't give an Oscar to a dog. So he didn't win the Oscar. Not to be eclipsed by their traditional rival, the cat served on all fronts and on the high seas in World War I. An estimated 500,000 cats served as vermin-catching mascots. One Belgian cat named Pichucci tricked a German patrol that the movement they saw in a shell crater was him, not his spying master. He jumped out of the crater, drawing the watch patrol's fire. The Germans missed, laughed about it, and moved on. When they were gone, Pichucci came back to his master. Felix the cat was not so lucky. We'll see his picture in a minute. He used to cross no man's land during the truce of 1914, when the British and German troops had a truce at Christmas, and they played soccer and exchanged gifts and all that. In fact, the troops that did that wouldn't fight, so they both pulled out and sent to different sectors. But this cat used to go back and forth between the lines when they were friendly. His name was Felix. When the French came, a French officer decided that Felix was a spy for the Germans and had him shot. We'll see the French officer in a second. There's the French officer. He looks like a villain, doesn't he? That's why I picked him. There were some big cats. There's 2 lions in this photograph, the lion cub. They were whiskey and soda, and they were from the American Escadrille, a aviation unit of Americans that fought before we entered the war. Whiskey's was one of the pets of Jervis Raoul Lufberry. He became an ace before America entered the war, flying with the Escadrille, and then became the commanding officer of the 94th Pursuit Squadron. There he is playing with the lion. You had a life expectancy of 15 minutes in the air in combat as a pilot in World War I. So playing with a lion, yeah, that's nothing. Now, he died very unfortunately because the generals decided that American pilots shouldn't have parachutes because they'd jump out of their expensive plane at the first sign of danger. So his choice was to burn alive because they were all gasoline and dope and they'd catch fire in a heartbeat, or jump to his death, and he jumped to his death when his plane got hit. Veterinary care was the countries that had. America didn't, because we didn't have dogs integrated with us. We took borrowed dogs from other countries to use, but the Germans and the British and the French had veterinary care for the dogs. They were, of course, protected from gas. Some animals' only function was a gas detector. The slug. If any chemical was in the air, the slug would curl over and become a mass of mucus to protect itself from the gas, long before you'd pick it up. So you'd have a slug in a jar with holes in it, and it would be your gas detector. Canaries could also, because their metabolism is faster, would succumb to gas before you did. They tunneled underneath the lines and then set up explosions to get the enemy, and so the tunnels had to be very deep so the enemy wouldn't hear you, and so they did their traditional canary in a coal mine, projecting CO2 buildup as well. Glowworms. You didn't want to strike a match in no man's land, you'd be killed, but you wanted to read your map. So if glowworms, the light isn't very bright, so you'd have glowworms, you could read letters and map information using the glowworm. There were all kinds of different mascots. That's a pig. There were goats. From the barnyard, a lot of animals were used. Some therapy bunnies. They used wild animals as well. This is a boar, which is the mascot of the dispatch riders for the 26th Yankee Division, which Stubby was in. And that was their mascot. This foxes is an American with a fox. There's a Japanese soldier with a fox. He's trained to pull stuff. Now, the Japanese were on the Allied side in World War I and treated their prisoners of war very, very well. Not so much in World War II. There's a raccoon back in America. There's a gator in America, a fort in America. There were exotic animals. This is a wallaby with the Australians. That's their possum. The Australian possum is way cuter than our possum. That was a mascot. They brought koalas. Where they got eucalyptus leaves, I don't know, but they brought them with them. Here's a monkey at Camp Devens. It wasn't Fort at that time. And the most famous primate was Jackie the baboon. He was a pet of Albert Marr of South Africa. When Marr enlisted, he was surprisingly allowed to bring Jackie. Jackie was enlisted, complete with uniform, pay book, and rations. He stood and saluted officers. He would even light officers' cigarettes. He used the latrine with the other men. He would he'd write with a lighter. He'd light the cigarettes for officers with a lighter. He was an excellent sentry because his sense of hearing, sense of smell was better than ours. Here's Jackie. He knew how to use cutlery. Like I said, he was a better sentry. While building a wall of stone to protect himself during a bombardment, he was severely wounded. The doctors had to put him under to take his leg off, and Jackie dutifully lapped up the chloroform, and the amputation was a success. He was awarded a medal for valor, promoted to a corporal, and he was discharged with a military pension. I think they should do, you know, everybody works with chimpanzees. That's pretty impressive, you know. Bears were very common. It's the last animal we'll talk about. On the way to Europe, a Canadian cavalry officer, Harry Colburn, bought a small bear cub from a trader at a train stop. You know how the people always trying to sell you bear cubs at train stops. He named her Winnipeg after his home city in Manitoba. She was the company mascot and was an extraordinarily gentle bear. He decided not to take Winnipeg to the horrors of the trenches in France and left her at the London Zoo. While at the London Zoo, he enamored A.A. Million's young son, Christopher Robin, so much he renamed his teddy bear Winnie the Pooh. For a few pence, you could send your kid into the cage with Winnie, and you could feed her honey. Zoos are a little different today. And that's Christopher Robin feeding Winnie the Pooh right there. Harry survived the war and left Winnipeg at the zoo when he returned home. The rest is, as they say, history. If you like this lecture, I have several other lectures, and we'll talk before any organization, because that's all we got going on, trying to raise awareness. D-Days and its ties to Cape Cod, which is an amazing lecture, is one of the subjects. The Cradle of Invasion, and there's a book, if you're interested, of the construction of the different Camp Can Do It, Camp Had Done It, and Washburn Island. There's an album right there you can look at afterwards. I'm doing a lecture, Cradle of Invasion, Friday at 1 o'clock at the Osterville Library, right down the street from Camp Had Done It. So that's fun. I have Gunpowder and Grease Paint, which I did here once, about how Gertrude Lawrence, the first composite anti-aircraft demonstration battalion, Royal Artillery, and the Anti-Aircraft Artillery Training Command all got together on a beach in Sandwich in 1943. And that's an interesting one. I got the Yankee Division in World War II. Yankee Division in World War I, that's General Edwards, who the Camp Edwards is named after, and Stubby was in. And the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is tough. There's very, very few funny things in that one. So, any questions, comments? As a subject, would people be interested in trying to find out the uses of animals in World War II? Is that because I know the Polish had a bear that drank beer, smoked, and loaded artillery. And that's one of the things you come across. They made the patch bear for their unit, but he'd carry stuff, he'd join the guys in and stuff like that. And of course, there are amazing dog stories in World War II as well. And there was a similar pigeon story I know in Italy where the Americans were going to blow their own troops up, and one of the Holman pigeons came back and told them that not to do that. So there is a whole other. They still use animals quite a bit in World War II. Yes, sir.
What breed was this sergeant?
The real Sergeant Stubby was a mutt who wandered onto the campus. He looks to me, by his size and brindle coat and stubby tail, that he's a Boston Terrier cross. He may be he could be. The Boston Terrier back in the day was bigger than the one we're used to. So whether I don't think he's a pure Boston Terrier because the ears and stuff like that, but they didn't quite look the same as the dog we're used to now. But I would say the real one was a Boston Terrier cross. And they didn't, he wasn't bred on purpose, so he could have had something else, Jack Russell, Boston Terrier, something like that. Any other questions? Yes?
I was curious about the picture of the alligator. The alligator with his little leash.
Yes. Again, the people lived with animals a lot closer back in the day. Remember, automobiles were only around for 20 years. So the relationship you had with your animals was very different. I've seen a guy on YouTube who's got an alligator that comes up and lays on him and follows him around and everything like that. There's a guy who has one that's friendly. You got me. I wouldn't trust something that when it gets big enough wants to eat you, but they've seen that, so. Well, those are mascots. They were just mascots for the troops. In fact, in World War II, they tried to make an otter at Washburn Island the mascot for the amphibious corps because obviously otters are amphibious, but it didn't do well in captivity, so they let him go. And they said in the newsletter they said he went AWOL, but they actually he didn't do well. It didn't let him go. But yeah, guys, you're lonely. They were there was 18,000 troops in the Washburn Island area, and if anybody had a kitten or a cat or a dog loose, it was gone to the island for the boys because they're lonely, so. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little bit about your dog?
My dog is Sergeant Stubby, named after the World War I hero dog, is a Beagle. He is 3/4 bulldog, which is the unhealthiest breed in the world. They can't breathe, they have cherry eye, they have skin fold problems, hip dysplasia, etc., heart things. But the Beagle is one of the healthiest dogs in the world. That's why they use them as lab dogs, because they're very healthy. So he is 1/4 Beagle, and we have not had a vet bill with him. He's 3 years old. But it's called a Beagle, like Beagle. Remember Puggles? Pug Beagle cross. He's a Beagle Bulldog cross. So Beagle is the breed. They're getting more and more popular because, again, the Bulldog has so many health problems. I forget there's a country in Europe that won't allow Bulldogs to be bred anymore. And Bulldogs, by the way, have to be born by cesarean section. They can't even reproduce, because they've bred them so crazily strange. But his mother was a 50-50 Bulldog Beagle, and his father was pure Bulldog. And he was a natural birth. No epidural.
Did you go to a breeder and say, I want the 3/4
I looked around after the movie came out for a puppy that had the similar markings as the animated one. And I had trained, I'm a dog trainer by trade, and I had trained a Beagle with similar markings prior, so I was looking for a Beagle with that. And I went down to, I found one online in Pennsylvania, and he was available. So, but you have to watch if you go into Pennsylvania and Ohio, because the Amish breed dogs, and they are not good to dogs. They run the puppy mills. Amish are nice to people, I guess, but they're not. They think animals were put on the earth by God for their use. So they think nothing of breeding a bitch every heat cycle and keeping them in cages. And they charge just as much as the regular, real bred dogs, but they don't. So I called, had the person I talked to was a Mennonite, and the Mennonites are okay. The Amish are jerks. And they have electricity and stuff like that. And so I got her veterinarian's number, and I called her up because I want to make sure I wasn't driving to Pennsylvania back for a puppy mill, right? And he goes, oh, no, they only have 3 dogs, 6 cows, 10 geese, chickens, 5 kids, sheep. So, yeah, he lived on a farm. And Stubby, the only time he runs away is if he hears children playing, because he was the favorite of one of the the Mennonite children's boys' dogs. So I pulled him from a little kid's arms and took him away. Yeah, so that's how I got him. It was 14 hours, it was a long day, long drive. Yes, sir. No, yes, no? Did you raise your hand or you just yawning? Oh, how did the real Sergeant Stubby not recognize him? How do you know there's a German spy out there, not an American? Probably by the diet. Because what you eat is extruded out your pores. The special forces in Vietnam had to eat a Vietnamese diet because the Viet Cong dogs would track them if they didn't, because of the scent of the food coming off of you. Yes, sir.
Kind of a similar thing in Russia. Their dogs were trained to the scent of lifebuoy, soap, bar soap, because that's what the Americans tended to use, which is that type of a soap, as opposed to the soaps that the Russians used. So their dogs could track an American because of the soap smell.
Yeah, interesting. Well, the Russians didn't use soap. I don't know. That was just probably more than, if I know Joe Stalin, that's more of it. Yeah. No, it's an amazing thing. And the same thing. Our guard dogs in Vietnam and military dogs would know if it was an American patrol coming in or a Viet Cong patrol out there because of the scent of the humans. Again, probably by diet. You can smell sea rations coming off of somebody as opposed to fish heads or whatever, and rice. But yeah, they can smell, a million times better. They can locate cancer. They do amazing stuff. Yes, ma'am?
Oh, I was just wondering, because we use the dogs now for search and rescue and cadaver dogs, did they do that in World War I too, or not too much?
Well, again, the dogs would go out in the dark to find wounded soldiers and stuff like that. Yeah, the mercy dogs would go out by themselves during the day. Hopefully, because they had the Red Cross, nobody shot them, because they don't have a weapon or anything. They're just going to help people. But yeah, they could find people. Yeah, they smell like a million times better than we do. Dogs who are untrained find cancer on people. The medical community knows this, but they keep trying to make a multi-million-dollar machine to detect cancer in people rather than using an $800 lab. I don't know why, but well, I suppose you can't make money off that. So but yeah, dogs are amazing, scent-wise. There was a bloodhound. I'll tell you how interesting it can be. There was a suicide, but it actually was a murder. And they didn't know it was a murder until an autopsy occurred. But they went then, because when they got to the house, all the doors and windows were locked, and the person was dead inside. But they could tell by the angle of the bullet, it couldn't have held the gun and done it. So now they knew it was a murder, but it was 180 hours after the fact. They found one window over the kitchen sink was unlocked, so the murderer had to climb out that window. They brought a bloodhound in. It sniffed the base of that outside of that window and tracked to a neighbor's. Well, it was down south, so a neighbor's trailer. And that stood up in court because that dog's nose is an instrument of the court. And that's the person who murdered. The 180 hours, rain, everything happened in between. It tracked 180 hours after the fact. That's how well they can smell. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming. A little while, Stubby do his thing.